Hello and welcome to 100 Yards of Football, Sports Talk Radio. I'm your producer, Jeremiah Long, and joining me to talk about Mike Kenn from the University of Michigan and the Atlanta Falcons, an absolute college and NFL legend, are our hosts, Mr. Vincent Turner and Mr. Harper LaBelle. How's it going, guys?
Hey, how you doing this morning, Mr. Jeremiah Long?
I am doing great. It is the first Monday of fall. That means that we are all the way into football season. That means it's time for tailgating. That means it's time to talk about the legends. And one of the best parts of our show and one of the best parts of football fandom is just sitting around talking about the greatest hits, talking about the way that it should have been, the way that it did go, all of the amazing history that goes with the fandom itself, but also with American football, as a part of our culture. Because I knew growing up, in the late 90s, I was in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1998. And I know for sure when you see that sea of orange and you know that the momentum is behind your team, there is something that is intangible about that, but is so tangible at the same time. You can feel it in the air. You can smell it. You can feel it on your skin, but you don't know what's going to happen to those young men when they walk onto the field. They're young men in the prime of their early lives, and they're all going to make individual decisions. But it sure feels like all of us 100,000 plus fans over in the stadium when we were looking out there and Neyland Stadium, and we're like, no, we are the ones who are helping this team to win. Like that feeling is just immeasurable, honestly. So I know that today we're talking about another immeasurable talent. So I would just love to hear a little bit more about what you're thinking here, Vincent, and I'll turn it over to you and Mr. LaBelle.
If you like the video this morning, please come in and share it. We'll surely appreciate it here at 100 Yards of Football. As he just mentioned, my name is Vincent. I'm going to use the W this morning that my parents gave me, Turner, out of the 901 Memphis, Tennessee. And joining me, it's a blessing when you got somebody that was, I want to say, in the battle. This gentleman played a long time in the National Football League. And he's a teammate of the guy that we're talking about today, our NFL legend, Mike Kenn. So I'm going to turn it over to him. Mr. Harper LaBelle, tell us what was it like to play with a legend, a guy a lot of people consider one of the top 5 left tackles in the game.
Well, the interesting thing for me, Vincent, is the 11 years that I played with different teams, Seattle, Philadelphia, here in Atlanta, I was in Baltimore, I was in Chicago for a year, is with the exception of Jonathan Ogden, I can't think of any offensive lineman that stands out as much as Mike Kenn does. There were some really good players, but it's so difficult to get the recognition and the honor of being one of the best at any of the offensive line positions. It's hard to do. So Mike comes out of the University of Michigan. He's 6'7". He had played lacrosse. He had played hockey. He's an athlete. He's got good feet. He was a little light at about 245 pounds when he was first drafted. He got up to about 290, but he was a guy with what I call a small waist. There are some big guys that weigh 300 pounds, but they're heavy. They're big. They're large, if you know what I mean, especially around the waist. Mike was a thin-waisted guy, and he could run, but he was a technician. He was a foot first guy. Where my feet are depends on where I'm going to be and how well I'm going to do. So he worked on that all the time. And you think, how simple is it if you take one foot and just go back? If he's a left tackle, you take your left foot, you drop that back about 12 inches, and then you take your right foot and you drop it back about 6 inches, and you keep that separation. It's called having a post foot. And he mastered that and worked on it all the time. So he was always in good position, and the rest of his body, his legs, his waist, his shoulders, his hands especially. He went a whole season without having a penalty. He was a guy that was a player rep back in the time when that was taboo, and you might end up being removed from the roster, but he was too good. Then he became the president of the Players Association, which is even worse in the relationship between the owners and the players. He was one of those guys that was willing to put his foot, he was willing to put his body, he was willing to put his mind in between a business environment that was changing and the landscape was being different. But Mike was a very, very good player. He obviously accelerated from the draft with coming from Michigan and getting to the Atlanta Falcons in 1979, his first year. He was drafted in 78, excuse me. But his first year that he really took hold was 79. He became a starter. He started every game that he played. So if he was on the field, he was a starter. So those are some of the things that stick out in my mind about the greatness of him. I know you have some other things in mind, Vincent. Let's hear about those.
He played in 251 games and started 94 consecutive games. But I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to leave it at this. Where I come from, Memphis, Tennessee, we always had a saying back in the day in the 70s and 80s, you judge by who you play against. You play against the best. And one thing, looking over Mike Kenn's career, and I just come to my mind and just say, look who he went against when he got in the league. Leroy Selman, Evan Bethel, Lai Alzado, Jack Youngblood, and Fred Dreyer. Then continue his career in his division, Fred Dean, Charles Haley, Harvey Martin, Too Tall Jones, LT, Lawrence Taylor, Hugh Green, Ricky Jackson, come on, man, Chris Dolman, Bruce Smith, the talent he faced, Richard Dent. And then I go back to 1991. He a little older. He goes up against Pat Swilling in a game they play in New Orleans, the rivals of the Atlanta Falcons, Mr. Harper. And he shuts out Pat Swilling, who that year had 17 sacks. See, I don't want to care about the Falcons record, what they did at that time. I'm talking about this guy faced the best of the best at a high level. In the pass rushes I just mentioned, LT, Richard Dent, let me throw in there Dexter Manley, who I saw play at Oklahoma State. Charles, man, that's what we call that smoke. That's smoke. And can you imagine preparing for those players every week? We're talking about Hall of Famers here, man. Bruce Smith, Andre Tippett. I could go on and on. I'm sorry. Top 5 offensive tackle, in my opinion, in NFL history. Back to you, Harper.
Yeah, one of the neat things about Mike is in that group, let's put it together, any offensive line, you got to have more than one. I remember Chris Hinton, Bill Fralick, Jamie Dukes, Houston Hoover. When the salary cap started kicking in, it really affected your ability to be able to keep a bunch of guys under contract because someone would want a raise. And if they would want the raise and it was a little too high for the local team, but if someone else was interested, they'd leave. So you'd have guys that would move. And Mike stayed. Mike was a Falcon his entire career. You mentioned Hall of Fame status. He. What else do you need to do? Blocking all those guys that you did? I'd like to see the numbers about Derek Thomas getting 5, 6, 7 sacks in one game against the Seahawks, but how many did he have against Atlanta? Those are the types of numbers that you'd really have to dig deep into. And I know the sports writers have passed him by year after year. We're not going to worry about it. But who else was better? I mentioned Jonathan Ogden. There are a couple of guys that were standouts. Jonathan and Mike are both 6'7". Jonathan weighed about 320. Mike was 295. So big difference in the body type. But he was a guy that, I'll tell you, he was just sound. He was a technician, as I mentioned. He didn't get beat around the outside. He didn't have a lot of penalties. He was a very, very good tackle, left tackle. Most important guy on your team is a quarterback. Who's the next most important guy? The guy that protects your quarterback. So he was a number 2 priority. You could start any offensive line at any era, and if you're going to pick a lineman, Mike would be one of the first ones that you would select. There aren't a whole lot of them. So kudos to Mike. What a great career he had. He represented the players well, represented himself, his team well, and obviously with his family, his friends, a true, amazing Hall of Fame caliber player who's still yet to receive his gold jacket.
My final words about Mr. Mike Kenn, I'm going to say this, and I don't want to get no other fan base upset. If Joe Thomas from the Cleveland Browns can get voted into the Hall of Fame, if Art Shell from the Raiders can get voted into the Hall of Fame, the Las Vegas Raiders, Worthy Wolf from New Orleans / the Kansas City Chiefs, there's no question. What are y'all doing in the Hall of Fame, you writers, by not putting this man in the Hall of Fame? Because I look at the competition he went against. Those some more names out there. Darryl Talley, Leslie O'Neal, Mike Colford. These are guys that was in their prime that this gentleman right here went up against. And the team he played on, they didn't win, but sometimes maybe you can help me out, Harper. He might have been the best player on the field for the Atlanta Falcons. And they voted Joe Thomas in, I want to say, as a first-time Hall of Fame, first-time ballot, right? He didn't play on a lot of winning teams with the Cleveland Browns. But you're not going to tell Vincent Turner today, at 64 years old, he was a better football player than Mike Kenn. Any more final thoughts about your former teammate out of the University of Michigan, Mr. Harper LaBelle?
Well, I'll just tell you right now, you're looking at a picture of a guy. He was tough, he was sound, he was a leader. And what else could you ask for in terms of a football player? So he's a guy that you would want to pick. He was a number 1 draft pick, 1978, and well-deserving. So go Blue, go Mike.
If you like the video, please come in and share it. I want to give special thanks, honor, and prayers to our producer, Mr. Jeremiah Long, that made it happen today for us here on 100 Yards Football. Thank you to our audience out there at 100 Yards Football. Thank you again to this good-looking, handsome young man, Mr. Harper LaBelle, for joining us here on 100 Yards Football. All I can say is this. The University of Michigan, one of the best academic schools in America. Tom Harmon, 1940 Heisman Trophy winner, Desmond Howard. I'm going to tell you, it's a shame, a dishonor, and disrespect that this man is not in the Hall of Fame. Offensive tackle, Mr. Mike Kenn, by the way, the University of Michigan, the Atlanta Falcons. Hey, man, you should be in the Hall of Fame. Thank you. Be blessed. It's been a joy this morning here on 100 Yards of Football.